My ex-wife and her new boyfriend, a lawyer lover, took everything in the divorce. The house, the business, $8.70 million in savings, even custody of our 3 kids. Sue me, she laughed. I'm untouchable. Broke and alone. I went to close my grandfather's old savings account. IT should have had $100. The bank teller went pale. Sir, this account's been gaining compound interest since 1960. She turned her screen. What I saw left me speechless. My name's Garrett Harlow, and let me tell you something about the American dream. It's got a hell of a return policy, and mine got processed faster than a Black Friday refund. Not too long ago, I was living what everyone told me was the life. You know the one. $2 million house in Westchester with the kind of lawn that required a part-time groundskeeper and a full-time attitude. 3 kids enrolled in private schools where the tuition cost more than some people's mortgages. A construction supply business that was practically printing money, and a savings account so fat my accountant would actually get misty-eyed when he talked about it. I had the whole package deal, wrapped up with a bow made of tax-deductible charitable donations and country club memberships. I thought I'd made it. I thought I'd finally cracked the code to success, stability, and suburban bliss. Then came the divorce, and let me tell you, that bow unraveled faster than cheap Christmas wrapping paper in the hands of an overexcited 5-year-old. My ex-wife Clarissa, who I'd loved, supported, and frankly bankrolled for 2 decades, decided she wanted an upgrade. And her upgrade came in the form of Blake Anders, this slick-haired lawyer who specialized in what he called high-net-worth divorce cases, but what I called professionally sanctioned robbery with a briefcase. These 2 tag-teamed me in court like they were auditioning for legal WWE, complete with dramatic entrances and scripted emotional outbursts. I'm talking coordinated attacks, perfectly timed objections, and a judge who seemed more interested in their performance than actual justice. It was less your honor and more your entertainment. When the smoke cleared and the gavel stopped banging, they'd taken everything. And I mean everything. The house with its stupid perfect lawn? Gone. The business I'd built from scratch, working 18-hour days and surviving on gas station coffee and sheer stubbornness? Stripped away like I'd never touched it. The $8.7 million in savings that represented 20 years of smart investments, careful budgeting, and actually giving a damn about the future, vanished into their accounts faster than free pizza at a college dorm. And the thing that hurt most, my 3 kids, Liam, Sophie, and Caleb, they got custody of them too, because apparently being the parent who actually worked to provide for the family somehow made me the villain in this twisted narrative. When I tried to protest during one of the court sessions, actually attempted to defend myself and point out the absolutely insane inequity of what was happening, Clarissa had the audacity to lean back in her chair with this smirk that could have curdled milk and said, "Sue me." Oh wait, you can't afford to. She said it loud enough that the court reporter had to type it, loud enough that my own lawyer flinched, and loud enough that I realized just how thoroughly I'd been played. Blake, sitting next to her like the smug parasite he was, didn't even try to hide his grin. They were celebrating my destruction right there in front of a judge who seemed more interested in checking his watch than checking their math. Imagine watching 20 years of your life, 2 entire decades of building, growing, sacrificing, and working your ass off, disappear faster than a Wi-Fi signal in a basement, or your phone battery when you actually need it, or your will to live during a Monday morning conference call. That's where I was. That was my reality. I'd gone from millionaire to miserable in less time than it takes most people to refinance a car. One day I'm signing checks and reviewing quarterly reports. The next I'm sitting in a courtroom watching everything I'd built get divided up like a pizza at a kid's party, except I didn't even get a slice. Not even the burnt edge piece that nobody wants. But here's the thing about rock bottom, and I was about to learn this lesson real well. Sometimes it's not actually the bottom. Sometimes there's a basement below the basement, and sometimes, if you're really lucky, there's also a hidden door down there that leads somewhere completely unexpected. Life, as I'd soon discover, has this twisted sense of humor that makes even the darkest comedy specials look tame. It sets you up, knocks you down, lets you think you're completely finished, and then just when you're ready to tap out and admit defeat, it throws you the most ridiculous curveball you've ever seen. I spent those first few weeks after the divorce in a fog of disbelief and instant ramen. I'd moved into a studio apartment above a laundromat because it was all I could afford, and the smell of detergent and other people's dirty laundry became my new normal. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looked like a stranger, a tired, defeated stranger who couldn't believe this was how the story was supposed to go. I'd lie awake at night listening to the washing machines churning below me, thinking about how my entire life had gone through a spin cycle and come out torn, faded, and permanently damaged. My phone stayed mostly silent. The kids weren't taking my calls. Clarissa had gotten to them first, obviously, poisoning the well with whatever story painted me as the bad guy and her as the victim. Former friends from the country club suddenly had full schedules whenever I tried to meet up. Business contacts stopped returning emails. It was like I'd been erased from the life I'd built, digitally deleted from the universe I'd helped create. I was a ghost haunting my own existence. But karma, my friends, karma is patient. It doesn't rush. It doesn't stress. It waits for the perfect moment, and then it shows up wearing a suit, carrying a bank statement, and ready to remind everyone that the universe has one hell of a long memory. I just didn't know it yet. I was too busy surviving, too focused on figuring out how to pay rent and eat something other than dollar store noodles, too consumed by the immediate disaster to notice that somewhere in the background, the wheels of cosmic justice were already starting to turn. Let me take you back to the beginning, because every disaster story needs an origin, and mine started with optimism, duct tape, and a credit card that should have been declined. I wasn't born rich, not even close. My old man used to say, with that particular brand of working-class pride that turns poverty into poetry, we didn't grow up poor, Garrett, we grew up character building, which was his way of saying we ate a lot of hot dogs, wore hand-me-down clothes, and learned that vacation meant driving 3 hours to a lake where the fish were somehow more depressed than we were. But he taught me something valuable. If you want something in this life, you don't wait for it to fall into your lap like some trust fund kid. You build it yourself, brick by brick, invoice by invoice, mistake by painful mistake. At 25 years old, with a business degree from a state school that nobody's ever heard of and about $600 to my name, I started Harlow building supplies in my garage. And when I say garage, I'm not talking about some spacious 3-car suburban palace with epoxy floors and organized pegboards. I'm talking about a 1-car detached structure that leaked when it rained, had questionable electrical wiring that probably violated several safety codes, and housed a family of possums who I'm pretty sure were judgmentally watching my every move. My entire startup inventory consisted of supplies I'd bought at discount from a construction site liquidation sale, a rusty Ford van that burned oil like it was going out of style, and way too much optimism for someone whose business plan could fit on a napkin. Clarissa was there in the beginning, and I need you to understand that when I say there, I mean actually there, not just physically present but emotionally invested. Back then, love was real. It wasn't performative or transactional or dependent on how many digits were in the bank account. We ate ramen together and called it date night. We'd sit on our ratty futon in our cramped apartment, planning and dreaming and genuinely believing we could build something extraordinary out of nothing but hard work and stubbornness. She'd quiz me on supplier prices while folding laundry. I'd help her study for her dental hygiene exams while reviewing purchase orders. We were a team, or at least I thought we were. Funny how memory works, how it holds onto these golden moments and refuses to acknowledge that even gold can tarnish when you're not looking. I built the company with my brother Toby, who handled deliveries and had this uncanny ability to charm even the grumpiest construction foreman into giving us a shot. Toby was 3 years younger than me, built like he could lift a house with his bare hands, and had inherited all of Dad's working-class authenticity without any of the bitterness. He'd show up at job sites in his beat-up pickup truck, always early, always smiling, always ready to unload materials and crack jokes that somehow made hardened contractors actually like doing business with us. The guy could have sold ice to Eskimos, sand to Arabs, or extended warranties to literally anyone with a pulse. Then there was Nick, my best friend from college and our accountant, who genuinely believed that Excel spreadsheets could fix the world's problems if you just formatted them correctly enough. Nick was the numbers guy, the cautious one, the person who'd run 17 different financial projections before agreeing to any major decision. He wore the same 5 button-down shirts in rotation, drank black coffee like it was a personality trait, and had this nervous habit of clicking his pen during meetings that drove everyone insane but somehow kept us financially solvent. While Toby and I were out there hustling for clients and building relationships, Nick was back at the tiny office we'd rented above a pizza shop, making sure we didn't accidentally bankrupt ourselves through enthusiasm and poor math. We grew fast, faster than any of us expected, honestly. Within 15 years, we'd gone from my leaky garage to a legitimate warehouse operation supplying construction companies across New York. We weren't just surviving anymore, we were thriving. Major contractors knew our name. Our trucks were everywhere, distinctive with their blue and gold logo that Toby's girlfriend had designed for $200 and unlimited breadsticks at Olive Garden. We'd moved from scraping by to actually making millions, and I'm not going to lie, it felt incredible. It felt like validation for every 18-hour day, every missed social event, every sacrifice we'd made building this thing from scratch. But here's where the story takes a turn, where success starts breeding its own particular brand of poison. Clarissa quit her dental hygiene job, which, fair enough, made sense at the time since we could afford for her to stay home with the kids. But she didn't just become a stay-at-home mom. Oh no, that would have been too simple, too ordinary. She became what she called a full-time social strategist, which as far as I could tell meant she'd appointed herself as our family's ambassador to the world of people who had more money than sense and more opinions than actual jobs. Translation: she joined every country club committee in Westchester that had free champagne, expensive hors d'oeuvres, and enough pretension to choke a horse. Suddenly, our conversations changed. She stopped asking about the business and started talking about status optics and social positioning, like we were chess pieces instead of people. She'd come home from her committee meetings with complaints about how our house wasn't in the right neighborhood, how my truck was too practical and not luxury enough, how the other wives were all wearing brands I'd never heard of and carrying purses that cost more than our first apartment's rent. She wanted more, always more. A bigger house, fancier cars, private schools for the kids, even though the public schools in our area were perfectly fine. She wanted membership to clubs I didn't have time to visit and vacation homes I'd never have time to enjoy. Her new friend group included people with names like Brentley, Ashton, and Tinsley. You know, those names that sound like law firms or expensive luggage brands. But there was one guy she couldn't stop mentioning, one name that kept popping up in conversation with increasing frequency and enthusiasm: Blake Anders, a lawyer who specialized in what he described as high-net-worth divorce cases. She'd bring him up casually, like he was just another acquaintance from her social circles. Blake says the market's going to shift. Blake recommended this amazing financial advisor. Blake thinks we should restructure our assets for tax purposes. Blake this, Blake that. Blake apparently had an opinion on everything from our investment portfolio to the wine we should be drinking. Yeah, you can see where this is going, right? I mean, looking back now, the red flags weren't just waving. They were doing a whole choreographed dance routine with fireworks and a mariachi band. But I was too busy working, too focused on keeping the business growing and the money flowing, too trusting in the woman I'd built this entire life with to notice that she was already planning her exit strategy and had hired her escape vehicle to help engineer it. Our 20th anniversary. 2 decades of marriage, which according to the internet meant we were supposed to celebrate with china, fine, delicate china that's easy to break if you're not careful with it. The irony wasn't lost on me later, trust me. I'd marked it on my calendar weeks in advance, circled it in red like it was some kind of holy day, because despite how weird things had gotten with Clarissa and her champagne-soaked social climbing, I still believed we had something worth celebrating. I still thought that underneath all the country club nonsense and the name-dropping and the obsession with what other people thought, there was still us. The couple who'd eaten ramen and dreamed big dreams in that cramped apartment above the pizza shop. So I left work early, which was a big deal for me because leaving early meant trusting other people to handle things I usually micromanaged into oblivion. I stopped at the florist and picked up roses, 24 of them, red and expensive and arranged in that way that's supposed to communicate serious romantic intent. I had reservations at Marcello's, this Italian place where we'd gotten engaged 20 years earlier, back when a meal there meant we'd be eating peanut butter sandwiches for the rest of the month, but we didn't care because we were young and in love and convinced that our feelings could somehow override basic economics. The owner, Marco, still remembered us and had promised to set up our old table by the window, The one where I'd nervously fumbled through a proposal speech I'd practiced 17 times in the mirror. I drove home with those roses on the passenger seat, probably driving a little faster than I should have been because I was actually excited. Excited to surprise her, excited to maybe recapture some of that old magic, excited to prove that despite the bigger house and the busier schedules and all the complications that come with success, we were still Garrett and Clarissa, still the team that had built something from nothing. I had this whole evening planned out in my head. Romantic dinner, maybe a walk by the water afterward, reminiscing about the early days and laughing about how far we'd come. I was ready to press reset on whatever weirdness had crept into our marriage and get back to being us. Then I turned onto our street and saw Blake's BMW parked in my driveway. Not on the street like a normal visitor, not in the guest area like someone who was just dropping by. No, this car was parked right there in my spot, bold as hell, like it belonged there. It was one of those obnoxiously expensive models that screams, "I make more money than you and I need everyone to know it." Sleek and black, and probably worth more than most people's yearly salary. And it was sitting there, in my driveway, at my house, on my anniversary. You know that feeling when your stomach drops and your brain simultaneously speeds up and slows down, processing information faster than it wants to while also refusing to accept what it's seeing? That gut punch moment when your subconscious is screaming, "Danger, danger, danger," but your conscious mind is still trying to come up with innocent explanations? That's where I was. Maybe he's dropping off paperwork. Maybe it's a surprise party and Clarissa invited people over. Maybe there's a perfectly reasonable explanation for why my wife's lawyer friend is at my house on our anniversary while I'm supposed to be at work. But deep down, in that part of your brain that evolution designed to keep you alive by recognizing threats, I knew. I absolutely knew what was happening. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard I thought I might snap it in half. The roses on the passenger seat suddenly looked ridiculous, like props from a play I'd been performing alone while everyone else was in on a different script. I sat there in my truck, my practical, unglamorous work truck that Clarissa hated because it wasn't luxury enough for her new social circle, and I couldn't make myself get out. Couldn't make myself walk up to that door and confirm what I already understood in my bones. Instead, I watched. I sat there like some pathetic private investigator in a bad movie, engine off, windows cracked, watching my own house like it was enemy territory. And maybe it was. Maybe it had been for a while, and I'd been too busy working to notice that I'd become a stranger in my own life. I could see lights on upstairs, our bedroom, probably. I could hear faint music playing, something jazzy and inappropriate for 4:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. And then I heard laughter. Not the awkward, uncomfortable kind you'd expect if this was an innocent situation, but comfortable laughter, the relaxed kind that comes from people who've spent enough time together to develop inside jokes and shared rhythms. I sat there for 3 hours. 3 entire hours watching my anniversary dissolve into something I couldn't even name because the words were too ugly and the reality was too absurd. The sun started setting, painting the sky in those ridiculous romantic colors that seemed designed specifically to mock me. Orange and pink and purple, like the universe was putting on a show and I was the only audience member who understood the joke was on me. Finally, around 7:30, Blake emerged from my front door, and I watched him through eyes that felt grainy and exhausted like I hadn't slept in days. He took his time, too. Didn't rush out like someone who'd been caught doing something wrong. No, this guy straightened his tie, his expensive silk tie that probably cost more than my entire outfit, while Clarissa stood at the door in the silk robe I'd bought her for our last anniversary. The robe that was supposed to be special, intimate, ours. She was wearing it for him, standing there backlit by the warm glow of our foyer, and they were talking like this was normal, like this was just another Tuesday evening and not the complete destruction of everything I thought I knew about my life. He kissed her cheek before he left. Casual, familiar, comfortable. Then he climbed into his stupid BMW and drove away, probably heading home to his expensive apartment where he'd pour himself expensive scotch and congratulate himself on successfully destroying someone's life while billing hourly for the privilege. I watched Clarissa close the door and disappear back into the house that I'd bought, that I'd worked myself half to death to afford, and I realized she had no idea I'd seen anything. She had no clue I was sitting out here in the gathering darkness, holding wilted roses and a dinner reservation I'd never use. I didn't go in. Couldn't. Instead, I drove around aimlessly for another hour, eventually parking at a gas station where I sat under fluorescent lights eating a stale sandwich from the refrigerated section and trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do with this information. When I finally got home around 10, Clarissa was in the kitchen stirring pasta like this was any other night, like our anniversary hadn't happened, like Blake's car hadn't been in our driveway for hours. She looked up when I walked in and had the audacity to seem annoyed. "You're late," she said, not looking away from the pot. "You could have called." The next morning, I got served divorce papers at the office. Not at home where there was at least a shred of privacy and dignity. No, that would have been too considerate. Instead, a process server showed up at Harlow Building Supplies at 9:15 in the morning, right in the middle of our weekly staff meeting where 12 of my employees were gathered around the conference table discussing inventory projections and supplier negotiations. The guy walked in wearing a neon yellow vest like he was directing traffic at a construction site, asked loudly if I was Garrett Harlow, and when I confirmed that yes, unfortunately I was, he slapped a manila envelope into my hands with the kind of theatrical flair usually reserved for reality TV show reveals. "You've been served," he announced, like he was declaring me the winner of some terrible prize, and then he left while my entire staff sat there in shocked silence, watching their boss hold divorce papers like a live grenade. My operations manager, Sandra, who'd been with me since year 3 and had never seen me lose my composure, actually gasped. Toby, sitting at the far end of the table, looked like he wanted to punch someone or possibly throw up, maybe both. Nick just closed his laptop slowly and stared at me with this expression that said he'd seen this coming from a mile away and felt bad that I hadn't. I dismissed the meeting, told everyone to take an early lunch, and sat alone in my office reading through the most insane legal document I'd ever encountered in my life. Clarissa was claiming emotional abuse, financial control, and neglect, a trifecta of accusations so ridiculous they would have been funny if they weren't about to destroy my life. According to her version of events, I was basically a monster who'd spent 20 years systematically oppressing her through the terrible crimes of working too much, making financial decisions about the business I'd built, and missing some PDA meetings because I was busy keeping a multi-million-dollar company running. The court proceedings started 3 weeks later, and let me tell you, it was less pursuit of justice and more performance art designed by sadists. The courthouse itself was one of those imposing buildings with columns and marble floors that's supposed to make you feel like important decisions are being made by wise people, but really it just made me feel like I was about to be sacrificed at the altar of bureaucratic absurdity. Blake strutted around that courtroom like he was auditioning for the legal drama that would finally get him noticed by Hollywood casting directors. The man had clearly practiced his concerned but righteous attorney expression in the mirror, probably multiple times, perfecting that head tilt and furrowed brow combination that was meant to communicate both moral superiority and deep sympathy for his poor victimized client. He wore suits that probably cost more than my monthly rent was about to become, different ones each day like he was on some kind of evil lawyer fashion show. Navy pinstripe on Monday, charcoal gray on Tuesday, a bold dark burgundy on Wednesday that made him look like a wine stain that had achieved sentience and passed the bar exam. His shoes were always shined to a reflective finish. His hair was always perfectly styled with just enough gray at the temples to suggest distinguished wisdom, and he had this habit of adjusting his cufflinks before making particularly damaging statements, like he needed to make sure his accessories were properly aligned before he destroyed someone's life. My lawyer, Brian Keller, looked perpetually exhausted and vaguely apologetic, like he'd rather be literally anywhere else representing literally anyone else. I'd hired him because he came recommended by a business associate who'd gone through a simple divorce, which should have been my first red flag because there's no such thing as a simple divorce, just divorces where one person gets steamrolled so efficiently they don't have time to realize what's happening. Brian wore the same tired gray suit to every session, carried a briefcase that looked like it had survived several wars, and had this defeated energy that suggested he'd already accepted we were going to lose before we even started. He'd object occasionally, but weakly, like he was fulfilling some kind of legal obligation to at least pretend to defend me, but didn't actually believe any of it would matter. The real star of this circus, though, was Judge Harold Benson, Blake's golfing buddy, and apparently the universe's way of proving that the justice system is less blind lady with scales and more old boys club with selective vision. This guy sat up there behind his bench looking bored and irritated, like we were all inconveniencing him by having the audacity to need his judicial services. He was probably in his mid-60s, with that particular kind of face that suggests a lifetime of expensive meals and zero accountability. His robes were always slightly wrinkled. He checked his phone more than he paid attention to testimony. And he had this habit of nodding along to whatever Blake said like he was listening to his favorite podcast. Blake came prepared with evidence that would have impressed a Hollywood prop department. He produced journals, supposedly written by Clarissa, that detailed years of my alleged emotional abuse and neglect. Page after page of carefully dated entries describing how I'd ignored her, dismissed her feelings, controlled every aspect of her life, and generally behaved like some kind of domestic tyrant. The handwriting looked like Clarissa's, or at least close enough that disputing it would have required expensive forensic analysis that Brian didn't seem inclined to pursue. Each entry was a masterclass in manipulation, describing incidents that had either never happened or had been twisted so thoroughly that they barely resembled reality. There was an entry about how I'd forbidden her from buying a new car, when in reality I'd suggested we wait 3 months until a better model came out that she'd specifically said she wanted. Another entry claimed I'd humiliated her at a dinner party by discussing finances, when what actually happened was someone asked about the business, and I'd answered politely for maybe 2 minutes. My favorite was the entry about how I'd missed Sophie's school play, causing Clarissa severe emotional distress. Never mind that I'd been at a critical supplier negotiation that kept our business from losing a major contract, or that I'd apologized profusely and took Sophie out for ice cream and let her give me a private encore performance of her entire part. Blake presented these journals with the solemnity of someone unveiling ancient religious texts. He'd read passages aloud in this grave, concerned tone that made me sound like an absolute monster. Your Honor, if I may direct your attention to the entry from March 15th, where Mrs. Harlow describes feeling invisible in her own home. Judge Benson would nod sympathetically, shooting me looks that suggested I was personally responsible for every unhappy marriage in America. Brian would occasionally object with the enthusiasm of someone ordering plain oatmeal, and the judge would overrule him before he'd even finished his sentence. They brought in a parade of witnesses, mostly Clarissa's country club friends, who testified about how sad and neglected she'd seemed. Whitney something hyphenated claimed she'd seen me dismiss Clarissa at a charity gala, which translated from rich person speak meant I'd been networking with potential clients instead of standing next to my wife all evening admiring her dress. Donna Van something testified that Clarissa had confided feeling financially trapped, which was hilarious considering she'd spent the last 5 years dropping money like it was a competitive sport. These women sat on that witness stand in their designer outfits, clutching their expensive handbags, describing my wife's terrible suffering with all the sincerity of soap opera actors going for their Emmy reel. The financial portion was where things got truly absurd. Blake produced documents showing that I'd controlled all our assets, making unilateral decisions about investments and savings. What he called control, I call being the person who'd actually built the business and understood how money worked. Yes, I'd made financial decisions. Someone had to, and it certainly wasn't going to be Clarissa, whose idea of financial planning was deciding which country club to join based on the quality of their mimosas. Blake presented spreadsheets and bank statements with the kind of dramatic flair usually reserved for murder trials, acting like my habit of actually tracking where our money went was somehow evidence of financial abuse rather than basic responsible adulting. He pointed to my business account transfers, my investment decisions, my saving strategies, making each one sound like a calculated move to oppress my poor helpless wife who apparently had zero agency or ability to participate in conversations about our shared finances. Never mind that I tried multiple times to get Clarissa interested in the business side of things, offering to walk her through the books, explain our investments, involve her in major decisions. She'd always waved me off with some version of, "That's your thing, honey," and gone back to planning her next charity luncheon or committee meeting. But in Blake's retelling, I was a financial dictator who deliberately kept Clarissa in the dark about our assets so I could maintain power and control. The fact that she'd had complete access to all our accounts, her own credit cards with no limits, and the ability to spend whatever she wanted on whatever she wanted apparently didn't matter. According to this narrative, giving someone unlimited financial freedom while you worked 80-hour weeks to maintain that freedom was actually a form of abuse. The logic was so twisted it could have been a pretzel, but Judge Benson ate it up like it was gourmet testimony. They hit me with expert witnesses, too. A therapist who'd never met me, but had apparently counseled Clarissa through her trauma, and who testified about the typical patterns of financial abuse that perfectly matched whatever story Blake had fed her. This woman sat there with her degrees and her professional credentials, describing my behavior based entirely on Clarissa's version of events, painting me as this textbook case of controlling behavior. When Brian tried to point out that she'd never actually spoken to me or heard my side of things, Judge Benson shut him down faster than a bouncer kicking out a drunk college kid, saying something about how victims shouldn't be required to confront their abusers for expert testimony to be valid. The custody battle was even worse. Clarissa's lawyers, because apparently Blake had brought in reinforcements like this was some kind of legal Avengers situation, argued that my work schedule made me an absent father. They brought up every missed soccer game, every late pickup from school, every time I'd had to choose between a critical business meeting and a kid's event. They made it sound like I'd been deliberately avoiding my children rather than working my ass off to give them the kind of life where missing a soccer game was their biggest problem. They conveniently ignored all the weekends I'd spent coaching Liam's Little League team, all the father-daughter dates with Sophie, all the times I'd helped Caleb with his science projects at midnight after getting home from work. Blake even had the audacity to bring up my anger issues, based on one incident where I'd raised my voice during an argument about Clarissa spending $18,000 on a handbag. $18,000 on a bag to carry her phone and lipstick. When I'd pointed out that maybe, just maybe, that was an insane amount of money to spend on a fashion accessory, I'd gotten frustrated, and yeah, my voice got louder than usual. This was now being presented as evidence of my volatile temper and inability to communicate without aggression. The judge made notes like I'd confessed to something terrible rather than admitting I'd once been annoyed about absurd spending. Through all of this, Clarissa sat at her table looking appropriately victimized, dabbing at her eyes with tissues Blake helpfully provided, nodding sadly whenever particularly damning testimony came up. She'd dressed for the part too. Gone was the designer everything, replaced with modest outfits that screamed, "I'm just a simple woman who's been terribly wronged." She wore minimal makeup, pulled her hair back in a plain ponytail, and had somehow mastered this expression of wounded dignity that would have won her an Oscar if there was a category for best performance in a divorce proceeding. A couple of times she looked over at me with what I can only describe as practiced sadness, like she was genuinely sorry this was happening, but had no choice because I'd forced her hand by being such a terrible husband. The whole thing lasted 6 weeks. 6 weeks of sitting in that courtroom listening to my life get rewritten as a horror story where I was the monster. 6 weeks of watching Judge Benson nod along to Blake's performance while barely acknowledging Brian's attempts at defense. 6 weeks of my kids not talking to me because Clarissa had convinced them I was the bad guy, that I'd done something so terrible it justified all of this. 6 weeks of my business partners tiptoeing around me, my employees avoiding eye contact, my entire life becoming this public spectacle of failure and humiliation. When the verdict finally came down, Judge Benson delivered it with all the emotion of someone reading a grocery list. He might as well have said, "Congratulations, Garrett. You've won absolutely nothing except the opportunity to watch everything you've ever worked for get redistributed to people who hate you." Clarissa got the house, all 6,000 square feet of it with the stupid perfect lawn and the chandelier she'd insisted we needed in the foyer. She got primary custody of the kids with me relegated to supervised visits every other weekend, like I was some kind of danger to my own children. She got the business, my business, the company I'd built from nothing, that I'd poured 2 decades of my life into, because apparently her contributions as a supportive spouse entitled her to ownership of something she'd never actually built or run. And then there was the money. The judge ordered me to pay alimony that would have made a lottery winner nervous, $45,000 per month, because Clarissa had become accustomed to a certain lifestyle, and it would be unfair to expect her to adjust her spending habits just because we were getting divorced. Never mind that her lifestyle was entirely funded by my work, or that she was perfectly capable of getting a job herself. Nope, I was required to maintain her in the manner to which she'd become accustomed, which apparently meant country clubs, designer everything, and the financial freedom to continue pretending she was an heiress rather than a dental hygienist who'd married well. Child support was another $12,000 per month, which would have been fine except I wasn't allowed to actually see my kids more than 4 days a month. I was paying for their private schools, their activities, their everything, while Clarissa got to be the fun parent who was always around, and I became the ATM they occasionally visited under supervision. But the real kicker, the thing that made me want to laugh and scream and possibly set something on fire, was the savings. Judge Benson ordered that the $8.7 million in our joint accounts be split 70-30 in Clarissa's favor because I had greater earning potential and she needed security given her years out of the workforce. So she got roughly $6.1 million of the money I'd saved through decades of careful investing and financial planning, while I got to keep about $2.6 million, which sounds like a lot until you factor in the legal fees, the taxes, and the fact that I'd just lost my primary source of income. When it was all tallied up, when Blake had finished explaining the settlement terms with barely concealed glee, I'd been ordered to hand over everything that mattered. The house, the business, the majority of our savings, my children, and my dignity, all gift-wrapped and delivered to the woman who'd been cheating on me with her lawyer while planning this entire catastrophe. As we left the courtroom that final day, Blake actually had the nerve to approach me in the hallway. He straightened his tie, that same self-satisfied gesture I'd come to associate with my life falling apart, and smiled like we were old friends. "No hard feelings, buddy," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "It's just business. Just business." Like he hadn't just orchestrated the complete destruction of my life. Like he hadn't been sleeping with my wife while helping her rob me blind. Like business was a reasonable explanation for ethical bankruptcy and legalized theft. I wanted to respond, wanted to say something cutting and memorable, but what was the point? He'd won. They'd all won. And I was standing there holding papers that detailed exactly how thoroughly I'd been destroyed, trying to figure out how I was going to survive what came next. Sure, Blake, I thought, watching him walk away toward where Clarissa was waiting by the elevators. It's just business. And arson is just extreme redecorating. I moved into a studio apartment above a laundromat on the kind of street where optimism goes to die and car alarms provide the soundtrack to your existential crisis. The place cost $900 a month, which sounds cheap until you realize what you're actually getting for that price. For 100 square feet of depression-painted beige, a kitchenette that was less kitchen and more vague suggestion of cooking capability, a bathroom where the shower, toilet, and sink were close enough to use simultaneously if you were flexible enough, and a window with a view of a brick wall that somehow looked more successful than me. The brick wall had better prospects. The brick wall had more dignity. Hell, the brick wall probably had better credit. The laundromat below ran 24 hours a day, which meant I got to fall asleep every night to the soothing sounds of industrial washing machines and the occasional domestic argument in 3 different languages about whose turn it was to separate the whites from the colors. The smell of detergent and fabric softener seeped up through the floorboards until everything I owned smelled like I'd been living inside a Tide commercial, except without any of the happiness or clean laundry satisfaction those commercials promised. Sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd lie there listening to the dryers tumbling below me and think about how appropriate it was that my life had literally been taken through the spin cycle and come out damaged and wrinkled. The apartment came furnished, which sounds like a perk until you see the furniture. We're talking a futon that had clearly witnessed things no piece of furniture should have to witness, a card table that wobbled like it had a neurological condition, 2 folding chairs that threatened to collapse if you sat down too confidently, and a TV from roughly the Clinton administration that had 3 channels and only worked if you positioned the antenna at a precise 47-degree angle while standing on 1 foot and praying to whatever god governs outdated electronics. The kitchen had a hot plate, a mini fridge that hummed louder than a death metal concert, and exactly 4 pieces of mismatched dinnerware that looked like they'd been stolen from 4 different yard sales. My nightly routine became a masterclass in rock-bottom living. I'd come home from whatever temp work I'd managed to pick up. Because yeah, I was working construction labor now. The guy who'd owned a multi-million-dollar construction supply company was now hauling lumber for $18 an hour. And I'd stand in my sad little kitchenette making instant ramen. Not the fancy ramen you get at trendy restaurants where they call it artisanal and charge you 20 bucks. I'm talking about the 25-cent packages from the discount grocery store, the ones that come with flavor packets containing enough sodium to pickle your internal organs and ingredients you can't pronounce without a chemistry degree. I got creative with it, though, because when ramen is your primary food group, you either learn to jazz it up or you lose your mind. Monday was add an egg if you've got one night. Tuesday was throw in some hot sauce and pretend it's fancy night. Wednesday was eat it dry like chips because you're too depressed to boil water night. Thursday through Sunday was a rotating selection of the same 3 flavors based on whatever was on sale: chicken, beef, or oriental, which I'm pretty sure isn't actually a flavor so much as a vague geographical suggestion. I seasoned everything with regret and ate standing up because sitting at that wobbly card table felt too much like admitting this was actually my life now. The loneliness was worse than the ramen, though. Way worse. My phone barely rang anymore except for spam calls about my car's extended warranty. Ironic, since I'd had to trade in my decent work truck for a 2003 Honda Civic that burned oil and made concerning grinding noises whenever I turned left. The few friends I'd thought I had vanished faster than free beer at a college party. Turns out when you go from successful businessman to broke divorced guy, your social circle shrinks proportionally to your bank account. The people I'd known through the business suddenly couldn't return my calls. The couples Clarissa and I used to hang out with sided with her because apparently in divorce, people pick teams like it's dodgeball in middle school. My kids wouldn't answer when I called. I'd try Liam's number, and it'd go straight to voicemail. That generic robot voice telling me the person I was trying to reach was unavailable, which felt like a metaphor for my entire relationship with my children now. I'd call Sophie and hear it ring 6 times before she'd decline it, which was somehow worse than it going to voicemail, because at least voicemail meant she might not have seen it. The decline button meant she saw Dad pop up on her screen and actively chose not to talk to me. Caleb was only 10, didn't even have his own phone yet, so reaching him meant going through Clarissa, which was about as likely as winning the lottery while being struck by lightning. Clarissa had poisoned that well thoroughly. I found out later, much later, after everything that happened next, that she'd told them I was broke and bitter, that I'd hidden money from her during the divorce, that I was angry and unstable and basically one bad day away from doing something crazy. She'd painted me as the villain in their story, the deadbeat dad who'd abandoned them for what exactly? A studio apartment above a laundromat? A life of instant ramen and crippling loneliness? Yeah, Mom, I really traded down on this deal. Living the dream over here. Toby was the only person who still talked to me, and even that had to be done in secret like we were conducting some kind of spy operation. He'd meet me at this dive bar on the edge of town where nobody we knew would ever go, the kind of place with sticky floors and a jukebox that only played songs from 1987. We'd sit in the darkest corner booth, and he'd slip me a 20 like he was passing state secrets, whispering that Clarissa was watching everything, man, even the family chat. She'd apparently appointed herself as the family's information czar, controlling the narrative and monitoring who talked to who. Toby said she'd even suggested to our mom that I might be dangerous now, that my mental state was concerning, which was rich coming from the woman who'd orchestrated the most elaborate betrayal since Judas figured out that 30 pieces of silver was a pretty good deal. She's got everyone convinced you're the bad guy. Toby told me one night over cheap beer that tasted like carbonated regret. Mom thinks you're having a breakdown. Sophie told her friends you guys barely knew each other because you were never home. It's all twisted up, man. She's rewriting history in real time and nobody's questioning it. That's when I realized I wasn't just broke. I was erased. Deleted from the life I'd built like a file someone dragged to the trash and then emptied just to make sure it was really gone. I was living proof that you could work your entire adult life building something, creating value, providing for people, and still end up alone in a studio apartment wondering if your existence even mattered to anyone. The depression was real, folks. Not the kind where you post sad quotes on social media and wait for people to ask if you're okay. The actual kind where you wake up. If you even manage to sleep and have to talk yourself through basic tasks like showering and putting on pants, because what's even the point? I'd stand there looking at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, this tired stranger with dead eyes and beard stubble that had gone from rugged to homeless without passing through trendy at all. And I'd think about how this was it. This was what happened when life decided you'd had enough good fortune and it was time to balance the scales. Then one night, digging through my dad's old storage boxes that I'd shoved in the apartment's only closet, I found something that would change everything. The boxes were full of the usual stuff you inherit when a parent dies. Old photos, his army medals, some tools, paperwork from his life that someone has to keep but nobody knows what to do with. I was looking for anything valuable I could pawn, honestly, because rent was due and I was about $40 short. That's where I was at, pawing through my dead father's belongings, hoping to find something worth enough to keep a roof over my head for another month. That's when I saw it. A dusty blue savings passbook from 1960, the kind banks used before everything went digital, before computers and apps and direct deposit. The pages were yellowed with age, held together with a rubber band that disintegrated when I touched it. The name on the front, written in fountain pen in my grandfather's careful handwriting, Garrett Eugene Harlow. My name. My grandfather's name. Our shared name. I opened it with hands that were suddenly shaking, and there on the first page was a deposit record, $100, dated October 12, 1960. Below it, in that same careful handwriting, was a note. For my grandson's future. Only in dire need. I laughed out loud, this slightly hysterical sound that echoed in my empty apartment and probably concerned my downstairs neighbors. Grandpa, I said to the empty room, to the ghost of a man who died when I was 12, buddy, we've reached dire levels of need. I'm one ramen packet away from eating the seasoning raw like it's some kind of sodium-based recreational drug. $100 from 1960 wasn't going to save me. I knew that. Even with interest, we were probably talking about enough for a decent dinner and maybe a tank of gas. But something about that note, about my grandfather thinking about my future back before I was even born, about him using those exact words, dire need, like he'd somehow known this moment would come, made me feel less alone than I had in months. The next morning, I put on my one clean shirt. The one I'd worn to court, because at this point my wardrobe consisted of work clothes and court clothes with nothing in between, and I decided to see what, if anything, was in that account. I had no idea I was about to win the lottery. I just thought maybe, possibly, I might have enough for a burger that didn't come from a value menu. The Chase Bank branch on Maple Street used to be First National Trust back in my grandfather's day, back when banks had marble floors and tellers who knew your name and the concept of customer service hadn't been replaced by ATMs and aggressive sales pitches for credit cards nobody needs. The building still had that old-school architecture, columns outside, high ceilings inside, the kind of place that was built to look important and permanent, like your money was being guarded by the architectural equivalent of a fortress. These days it was mostly filled with college kids opening their first checking accounts and confused elderly people trying to figure out why their debit cards weren't working at the gas station. I walked in wearing my court clothes, that one button-down shirt that had seen better days, but was still technically presentable if you didn't look too close at the fraying collar, carrying my grandfather's ancient passbook like it was the Holy Grail or possibly a ticket to a very disappointing show. I probably looked exactly like what I was. A desperate man clinging to the faint hope that 65-year-old banking records might somehow contain enough money for a security deposit on a slightly less depressing apartment, or maybe just enough for groceries that didn't require boiling water and a flavor packet. The bank was quiet that Tuesday morning, just a few other customers scattered around doing whatever banking business people do at 10:30 on a weekday. I walked up to the first available teller, a young woman named Maya according to her name tag, who had that particular expression of friendly professionalism that all bank employees are apparently issued along with their uniforms. She smiled at me with practiced politeness, the kind of smile that says, "I'm here to help you," while also communicating, "Please don't make this complicated because I have quotas to meet." "Good morning. How can I help you today?" she asked, her fingers already hovering over her keyboard, ready to process whatever simple transaction I needed, so she could move on to the next customer in the endless parade of people who needed to deposit checks or complain about fees. I slid the ancient passbook across the counter like I was presenting evidence in a trial, which I guess in a way I was. Evidence that my life might not be completely over. Evidence that maybe the universe had one good surprise left for me. I found this in my dad's stuff, I told her, trying to sound casual and probably failing. It's my grandfather's old savings account from 1960. I'm just wondering if there's anything still in it, or if I need to close it out, or, honestly, I have no idea how this works with accounts this old. Maya picked up the passbook with the kind of careful reverence you'd use handling an artifact in a museum, which wasn't entirely wrong since this thing was older than both of us combined. She examined it, turning it over in her hands, studying the faded ink and yellowed pages like she was trying to authenticate a historical document. 1960, she said, more to herself than to me. Wow. Okay, let me look this up in our system. These old accounts sometimes get transferred when banks merge or systems update, so it might take me a minute to find it. She typed something into her computer, squinting at the screen, then typed some more. Her expression shifted from professional politeness to confused concentration, her eyebrows drawing together like she was trying to solve a complicated math problem. She typed again, clicked her mouse a few times, then leaned closer to her monitor like maybe she was reading it wrong, and closer proximity would clarify things. That's when her face went pale, and I mean genuinely pale, like someone had just told her the building was on fire or her student loans had spontaneously doubled. "Sir," she stammered, her voice suddenly uncertain, her professional composure cracking like thin ice under pressure. I need to get my manager. Would you mind waiting just a moment?" Now, in my experience, "I need to get my manager" is never followed by good news. It's what they say when your card gets declined, when there's a problem with your account, when something has gone terribly wrong and they're not authorized to tell you how bad it is. My stomach dropped, and I immediately assumed the worst. Probably the account had been closed decades ago, or there was some kind of error, or maybe I owed the bank money somehow, because that's just how my luck had been running lately. Of course, my grandfather's well-intentioned gift would turn into another disaster. Of course, the universe wasn't actually throwing me a lifeline, but rather dangling one just out of reach to watch me struggle. Maya disappeared into the back offices, leaving me standing at the counter, trying not to look as anxious as I felt, very aware that the other customers and tellers were now glancing at me with curiosity. A few minutes later, minutes that felt like hours, because suspense is way worse when you're already at rock bottom and bracing for the basement. She returned with an older gentleman in a suit who had that particular air of banking authority that comes from years of saying no to people's loan applications and explaining why fees exist. "Mr. Harlow?" he said, extending his hand with a smile that seemed genuine, which immediately confused me because bank managers don't smile at broke people unless they're about to sell them something. "I'm Robert Grayson, branch manager. Please, come with me to my office." This was it. This was where he'd explain whatever terrible complication existed with my grandfather's ancient account, probably involving forms in triplicate and fees for maintaining inactive accounts that had somehow accumulated into more money than the original deposit. I followed him through the bank, past the other tellers who were absolutely watching this little drama unfold, through a door marked private, and into an office that was trying very hard to look more prestigious than it actually was. Leather chairs that were probably vinyl, a desk that was supposed to look like mahogany, framed certificates on the wall documenting Mr. Grayson's various banking achievements. He gestured for me to sit, which I did, perching on the edge of the chair like I was ready to bolt at any moment. He settled behind his desk and pulled up something on his computer, his expression unreadable but focused. He typed, clicked, typed some more, then just stared at his screen for what felt like an eternity while I sat there trying not to panic or pass out, or possibly both. Finally, he looked up at me, his expression somewhere between impressed and slightly disbelieving. "Mr. Harlow," he said slowly, carefully, like he was trying to make sure I understood what he was about to tell me. "This account has been continuously compounding interest at 7.5% annually since 1960. I blinked at him, trying to do math in my head and failing because I'd never been great at compound interest calculations, and also my brain was currently running on ramen and desperation. "So, what? Do I have enough for a decent burger now?" I joked weakly, because humor was basically my only defense mechanism at this point, and also I genuinely had no idea what 7.5% compound interest over 65 years would actually amount to. A few $100? Maybe 1,000 if I was lucky. Enough for first and last month's rent on a slightly better apartment? Mr. Grayson turned his computer monitor toward me, slowly, deliberately, like he was revealing the final answer on a game show. The number on the screen had more digits than I was expecting. Way more digits. So many digits that my brain initially couldn't process them as an actual amount of money, but rather as some kind of account number or routing code or bank error. $6,984,400. I stared at that number, convinced I was reading it wrong, convinced there had to be a decimal point I was missing or an extra zero that was a typo. $6,984,000 for $100. From a $100 deposit. From my grandfather's factory worker salary. From 1960. I started, then stopped, because words had completely abandoned me. My mouth was open, but nothing coherent was coming out. I probably looked like a goldfish having an existential crisis. That's correct, Mr. Grayson confirmed, allowing himself a small smile at my obvious shock. Compound interest is quite remarkable over extended periods. Your grandfather made an excellent decision with that deposit. I almost fell off the chair. Actually had to grip the armrest to keep myself upright because the room was suddenly spinning and my concept of reality had just been completely rewritten. $7 million. $7 million. I'd gone from pawning my dead father's belongings to being a millionaire in the span of one bank visit. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen to people like me, especially not people whose lives had recently been destroyed by ex-wives and corrupt lawyers. But Mr. Grayson wasn't done. He was looking at his screen again, scrolling through something, and his expression suggested there was more to this story. "Mr. Harlow," he said, and I could hear the careful control in his voice, the professional attempt to remain calm while delivering information that was clearly extraordinary. "That's not all. According to our records, your grandfather also purchased 5 shares of stock in 1965 that have been held in trust attached to this account." Stock, I repeated dumbly, because apparently my vocabulary had been reduced to single-word responses. Yes, 5 shares of Berkshire Hathaway, Class A. If you don't know about Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett's company, let me give you some context. 1 share of Berkshire Hathaway Class A stock is worth roughly, well, more than most people's houses. Significantly more. Like, you could buy a nice house in cash and still have change left over more. Those 5 shares, Mr. Grayson continued, clearly enjoying this reveal despite his professional demeanor, are currently valued at approximately $1.6 million each. I did the math even though my brain was currently malfunctioning. 5 shares, $1.6 million each. That's $8 million. $8 million more dollars. On top of the $7 million from the savings account. My grandfather, Eugene Harlow, factory worker, simple man who'd never made more than $30,000 in any given year of his life, had left me $15 million. I laughed. Just started laughing right there in Mr. Grayson's office. This slightly hysterical sound that probably made him concerned for my mental state. But I couldn't stop. Grandpa Eugene hadn't just left me money. He'd left me a masterclass in patience, in long-term thinking, in the power of time and compound interest. He'd worked in a factory his whole life and still managed to outsmart every financial advisor, every hedge fund manager, every person who'd ever called themselves a genius with money. And he'd saved me. From beyond the grave, from 65 years in the past, he'd reached forward through time and saved me. Mr. Grayson let me sit there in stunned silence for a moment, probably giving me time to process the fact that my life had just done a complete 180 so fast I was getting emotional whiplash. Then he reached into a drawer in his desk and pulled out a yellowed envelope, the kind that's been sitting in a safe deposit box or some bank vault for decades, protected from light and air and the general deterioration that comes with time. The envelope had my name written on it in the same careful fountain pen handwriting as the passbook, Garrett Eugene Harlow. And it was sealed with actual wax, like my grandfather had been living in a Jane Austen novel and wanted to make sure this letter had appropriate gravitas. Your grandfather left specific instructions that this be given to you when you access the account, Mr. Grayson explained, sliding the envelope across his desk toward me like it was a sacred artifact. It's been in our vault since 1985, waiting for this moment. My hands shook as I picked it up. The paper was thick, quality stuff from an era when people actually cared about stationery and letters meant something more than text messages and emails. I broke the wax seal carefully, feeling like I was opening a time capsule from a world that didn't exist anymore, and pulled out 2 sheets of paper covered in my grandfather's meticulous handwriting. The man had been a factory worker, but he wrote like a scholar, each letter perfectly formed, the lines straight even without ruled paper, the kind of penmanship they used to teach in schools before everyone decided keyboards made handwriting obsolete. I started reading, and I swear I could hear his voice in my head, that gruff but kind tone he'd had, the slight accent from the old country that never quite left him even after 50 years in America. Dear Garrett, if you're reading this, then life has hit you hard. I'm sorry for whatever brought you to this point, but I'm not sorry that I can help. I've been poor, boy, truly poor in ways I hope you never have to understand, and I learned some things about money and people that I want to pass on to you. The $100 I deposited in 1960 wasn't much, barely a week's wages. But I knew something that the rich folks didn't seem to know. Time is the secret ingredient. Not luck, not genius, not some special knowledge. Just time and patience. I put that money away not because I expected it to make you rich, but because I wanted you to have something that couldn't be touched by anyone else, something hidden and safe, growing quietly while the world moved on. Remember this, Garrett, what's hidden cannot be stolen. The people who flash their wealth, who show everyone what they have, who need the world to know how successful they are, they're painting targets on their backs. But what you keep to yourself, what you protect and hide away, that's truly yours. Nobody can take what they don't know exists. Never show all your cards. I learned this playing poker with the boys at the plant, and it applies to more than just cards. In life, in business, in relationships, always keep something in reserve. Always have an ace up your sleeve that nobody knows about. The moment you lay everything out for people to see, you've given them the power to take it from you. And here's the most important thing I learned. Never trust someone who practices their smile in the mirror. You'll meet people like this, people who've perfected their charm, who know exactly what to say and how to say it, who can make you believe anything because they've rehearsed it until it looks natural. These are the dangerous ones. The truly good people, the ones worth trusting, they don't have to practice their kindness. It comes naturally, imperfectly, honestly. I bought those Berkshire Hathaway shares because a friend told me about this guy Warren Buffett, who seemed to understand patience the way I did. 5 shares cost me everything I'd saved outside of your account, and people thought I was crazy. Eugene, that's too much risk, they said. Eugene, you're supposed to diversify. But I understood something they didn't. Betting on patience isn't risk. Betting on people who think short-term, that's the real gamble. I worked in that factory for 42 years, Garrett. I punched a clock, lifted heavy things, got dirty, went home tired. I never made much money, never had fancy things, never impressed anyone with my success. But I was patient, and I was smart enough to hide what mattered. You come from good stock, boy. Your grandmother and I raised your father right, and he raised you right. Whatever knocked you down, you've got what it takes to get back up. But this time, do it smarter. Use this gift not just to rebuild, but to rebuild differently. Don't make yourself a target again. Don't show the world everything you have. Keep some cards close to your chest. And when you're back on top, and you will be, because Harlow men don't stay down, remember that revenge is a dish best served with compound interest. I love you, grandson. I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry I won't be there to see what you do with this second chance. Your grandfather, Eugene Harlow. P.S. I hope you still like chocolate milkshakes. Remember when you were 8 and we'd sneak out for milkshakes without telling your grandmother? Go get yourself the biggest, fanciest milkshake you can find. You've earned it. I laughed until I cried, sitting there in that bank manager's office, tears streaming down my face while I made these weird hiccuping sounds that were half laughter and half sob. Mr. Grayson politely pretended to be very interested in something on his computer screen while I had what was probably the most emotional moment of my entire adult life. That man, my grandfather, Eugene Harlow, factory worker and secret financial genius, had written this letter 35 years ago, not knowing when or if I'd ever read it, but somehow knowing that when I did, I'd need every word. What's hidden cannot be stolen. Clarissa had taken everything she knew about the house, the business, the accounts she could see, but she hadn't known about this. Blake and his corrupt judge friend had divided up everything they could find, but they'd missed this entirely. My grandfather had taught me the most important lesson, and he'd done it from beyond the grave with perfect timing. Never trust someone who practices their smile in the mirror. I thought about Blake, about his perfect hair and his rehearsed expressions and his calculated charm. I thought about Clarissa and her performative sadness in the courtroom, those practiced tears and wounded looks. They'd both been playing roles, performing for an audience, showing the world exactly what they wanted it to see while hiding who they really were. And I'd been so honest, so open, so stupidly transparent about everything, that I'd made myself the easiest target in the world. I carefully folded the letter and put it back in its envelope, treating it like the treasure it was. "Thank you," I told Mr. Grayson, my voice still rough with emotion, "for keeping this safe. For all of this." He smiled, a real smile this time, not the practiced banking professional one. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man. I didn't know him personally, but the instructions he left were very specific and very clear. He wanted you to have this when you needed it most." He paused, then added, "I take it you needed it?" I laughed again, but this time it was pure relief. "You have no idea." We spent the next hour dealing with the practical matters, transferring the funds to accounts I controlled, handling the stock certificates, setting up proper security measures, discussing tax implications that made my head spin but were manageable when you're suddenly worth $15 million. Mr. Grayson recommended a financial advisor who specialized in sudden wealth management, which was apparently a real thing because enough people win the lottery or inherit money or discover ancient bank accounts that there's an entire industry built around helping them not immediately screw it up. "My advice," Mr. Grayson said as we were finishing up, "and I know you didn't ask for it, but I'm giving it anyway. Don't tell anyone about this. Not yet. Give yourself time to process it, to make smart decisions, to set things up properly. Sudden wealth makes people do stupid things, and it makes everyone around them act weird. Keep this to yourself for a while." It was like he'd read Grandpa Eugene's letter himself. "What's hidden cannot be stolen." "That's the plan," I told him. "Nobody needs to know about this except me and you and whoever handles my taxes." I walked out of that Chase Bank branch at 12:30 on a Tuesday afternoon feeling like Batman. Except my Batmobile was a 2003 Honda Civic with one working window and a concerning grinding noise, and my Batcave was a studio apartment above a laundromat that smelled like industrial detergent. But I had something Bruce Wayne would understand: a secret identity, hidden resources, and a score to settle. The sun seemed brighter somehow, the air cleaner, the world generally less terrible than it had been 2 hours earlier. I got in my sad little Honda, sat there in the bank parking lot, and just breathed for a minute. Clarissa thought she'd taken everything. Blake thought he'd won. Judge Benson thought he'd successfully railroaded another sucker through his corrupt courtroom. They were all celebrating their victory, dividing up my life like it was a prize they'd earned. They had no idea the universe had just wired me a $15 million comeback, courtesy of a factory worker who understood patience better than any of them ever would. I started the car, listened to it make its horrible grinding noise, and smiled. Time to get to work. Here's the thing about suddenly having $15 million that nobody knows about. It's the ultimate superpower, but only if you can keep your mouth shut and resist the urge to immediately start living like a lottery winner who's about to be broke again in 5 years. And let me tell you, the temptation was real. I wanted to walk into a car dealership and buy something that didn't sound like a dying robot when I turned left. I wanted to eat food that didn't come in a styrofoam cup with a flavor packet. I wanted to move out of that studio apartment where the smell of fabric softener had permanently bonded with my clothes at a molecular level. But Grandpa Eugene's letter kept echoing in my head. What's hidden cannot be stolen. So I didn't do any of that. Instead, I kept living exactly like I had been, broke, bitter, and barely surviving. I kept my job at Morrison's warehouse, hauling boxes and lumber for $18 an hour alongside guys who were legitimately struggling to make ends meet. My supervisor, Danny, was this perpetually stressed 45-year-old with 3 kids and a mortgage who treated every shift like we were storming the beaches of Normandy. "Harlow, those pallets aren't gonna move themselves," he'd yell, and I'd hustle over like my life depended on it. even though I could have bought his house in cash without checking my bank balance. The physical labor was actually therapeutic in a weird way. 8 hours of lifting and moving and not thinking, just doing, coming home exhausted enough to actually sleep despite the laundromat's 24-hour percussion ensemble. I kept eating instant ramen, kept driving my Honda Civic with its grinding noise and oil-burning habit, kept living in that depressing studio apartment like I was method acting for a role in a movie about rock bottom. My coworkers would sometimes invite me out for beers after work, and I'd have to decline because money's tight, man. Which was technically the truth if you defined your available spending money as the cash in my wallet and completely ignored the multi-million-dollar elephant in the room. They'd nod sympathetically, maybe spot me a beer anyway, and I'd feel like a fraud, but also like I was playing the longest con in history. The only change I made was finding a lawyer. A real lawyer this time, not some overworked public defender type who showed up to court looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. I needed someone who could fight Blake and his corruption machine without flinching, someone who understood that sometimes justice requires a sledgehammer instead of a gavel. After doing research that involved a lot of late-night internet diving and calling in favors from the few business contacts who still took my calls, I found her, Margot Price, known in legal circles as the Velvet Guillotine. The nickname should have told me everything I needed to know, but meeting her in person really drove it home. Margot's office was in Manhattan, one of those corner suites in a building where the elevator required a key card and the lobby had actual art instead of stock photos. She was probably mid-40s, dressed in a suit that cost more than 3 months of my fake rent, with perfectly styled black hair that had a dramatic white streak through it like she was a superhero in a legal drama. Her handshake could have crushed walnuts, and her smile suggested she ate other lawyers for breakfast and still had room for a croissant. "Mr. Harlow," she said, gesturing to a leather chair that was definitely real leather, not the vinyl pretending situation at my bank. "I've reviewed the preliminary information you sent. Your divorce cases." She paused, clearly searching for the right word. "Fascinating. And by fascinating, I mean an absolute dumpster fire of judicial corruption and legal malpractice that makes me embarrassed for my profession." I liked her immediately. "I'm going to be honest with you," she continued, steepling her fingers in that way lawyers do when they're about to tell you something you don't want to hear but need to know. "Going after a sitting judge and an established attorney like Blake Anders is going to be expensive, time-consuming, and potentially dangerous to your reputation. They will fight back. Hard. Are you prepared for that? I'm currently living above a laundromat eating 25-cent ramen and working a warehouse job while my ex-wife lives in my house with her lawyer boyfriend spending my money," I told her. "My reputation is already somewhere between deadbeat dad and cautionary tale. I've got nothing left to lose and a lot of anger to productively channel." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that probably made opposing counsel seriously reconsider their career choices. "Good. Anger is useful. Righteous anger is even better. And if what you've told me is accurate, we're not just talking about a bad divorce settlement. We're talking about conspiracy to commit fraud, judicial corruption, falsification of evidence, and possibly racketeering if we can prove a pattern of behavior." Over the next 3 weeks, Margot and her team of investigators, because apparently when you hire the Velvet Guillotine, you get a whole crew of legal assassins, dug into Blake Anders and Judge Harold Benson like archaeologists excavating a crime scene. What they found could have fueled a Netflix documentary series titled How to Destroy the Justice System, a Love Story. Blake, it turned out, had a very specific business model: identify wealthy men in shaky marriages, befriend their wives through social circles, help engineer divorces, and then split the proceeds through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts. He wasn't just a divorce lawyer. He was running a sophisticated operation that targeted exactly the kind of successful, trusting idiots I'd been. And Judge Benson was his partner in the whole scheme, getting kickbacks for every favorable ruling, every inflated settlement, every custody decision that benefited Blake's clients. The evidence was almost comically blatant once you knew to look for it. Bank transfers between shell companies that Blake controlled and offshore accounts linked to the judge. Multiple cases where the same pattern played out: wealthy husband, newer wife with expensive tastes, sudden divorce, massive settlements that defied standard calculations. Witnesses who'd been paid to testify, accountants who'd fudged numbers, therapists who'd written reports about clients they'd barely met. It was a machine, well-oiled and profitable, and they'd been running it for at least 7 years. But the real gold mine was Clarissa, my investigators. And yes, I was mentally referring to Margot's team as my investigators because it made me feel like Batman found that she hadn't just been a passive participant in Blake's scheme. She'd been an active collaborator. Those journals that Blake had presented in court as evidence of my emotional abuse, completely fabricated, written in a 3-week sprint leading up to the divorce filing. They found her Google search history, how to prove emotional abuse, journal entries for divorce court, how to fake PTSD from marriage, like she'd been researching for a particularly unethical term paper. Even better, they found emails between Clarissa and Blake dating back 2 years before the divorce, discussing strategy, planning the timeline, calculating exactly how much they could extract from me. We need to make sure he looks like the villain, one email read. If he comes across as sympathetic, we lose leverage. Another one. The judge says we can push for 70 to 30 on the savings if we time it right. They'd been plotting this for years, and I'd been completely oblivious, working 80-hour weeks to build wealth they were already planning to steal. The fake affidavits Clarissa had signed were particularly damning. Sworn statements claiming I'd hidden assets, threatened her safety, made her fear for her life. All lies, all documented, all provably false. Margot sat across from me in her office one afternoon, spreading out printed emails and documents like a dealer showing a winning poker hand, and said, "Garrett, I've been practicing law for 20 years, and this is the most clear-cut case of fraud I've ever seen. They weren't even careful. They thought they were untouchable. So what do we do?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. I just wanted to hear her say it. "We destroy them," she said simply, like she was suggesting we order lunch. Not just legally. I mean, we dismantle their entire operation, expose every case they've corrupted, and make sure they never practice law again. Blake will be disbarred and probably imprisoned. The judge will lose his pension and his freedom. And your ex-wife." She paused, that shark smile returning. "She's going to learn that fraud has consequences." "You want revenge or justice?" she asked me directly, leaning forward. "Why not both?" I replied. She laughed, this sharp sound of approval. "I knew I liked you. Okay, here's how this works. We file criminal charges: fraud, racketeering, judicial misconduct, conspiracy. We file civil suits to overturn the divorce settlement. We file bar complaints against Blake. We file motions to reopen every case Blake and Benson have worked together. We hit them from every possible angle simultaneously so they can't mount a coherent defense because they're too busy putting out fires." "How long?" I asked. "To file everything? 2 weeks, maybe 3. To see results? Could be months. Could be longer. Justice isn't fast, Garrett, even when it's obvious." "I can wait," I told her, thinking about Grandpa Eugene's letter, about patience and compound interest and the long game. I've gotten very good at waiting. Margot and her team worked with the precision of a surgical strike. They coordinated with the state attorney general's office, federal investigators looking into judicial corruption, the State Bar Association, and apparently half the law enforcement agencies in New York. Charges were drafted, evidence was compiled, witnesses were interviewed. It was a legal tsunami building offshore, and Blake and Clarissa had no idea it was coming. Meanwhile, I just kept working, kept hauling boxes at Morrison's warehouse, kept eating ramen in my depressing studio apartment, kept driving my terrible Honda Civic. Danny, the supervisor, actually pulled me aside one day and offered me overtime. "You're a good worker, Harlow. Reliable. Most guys in your situation would have given up by now." "Can't afford to give up," I told him honestly. "Got bills to pay." What I didn't tell him was that while those charges were being filed, while that legal earthquake was being prepared, I was also quietly repositioning pieces on the chessboard, making sure my assets were protected, my new accounts were properly structured, my security was tight. Because when this all went down, when Blake and Clarissa and the judge finally figured out what was happening, they were going to come after me. And I needed to be ready. 3.5 weeks after my first meeting with Margot, she called me at 7 in the morning. I was getting ready for my warehouse shift, trying to decide if I wanted chicken or beef ramen for breakfast, because that was my life now, making breakfast decisions that would depress a college student. "It's done," she said. "Everything's filed. The warrants have been issued. The arrests are happening this morning. By lunchtime, this is going to be all over the news. Good, I said, surprised by how calm I felt. No rage, no excitement, just quiet satisfaction. Thank you, Margot. Thank me by staying quiet and letting this play out. Don't post on social media, don't call anyone, don't gloat. Just live your life. Go to work. Act surprised when you hear the news. So that's exactly what I did. I went to Morrison's warehouse, clocked in, and spent the morning moving pallets like it was any other Tuesday, waiting for karma to finally show up fashionably late, but devastatingly effective. The morning it all blew up, I was eating a 99-cent donut from the gas station near my apartment, the kind that tastes like regret and corn syrup, but fills your stomach enough to pretend you've had breakfast. I was scrolling through my phone mindlessly when the first news alert popped up. Prominent NYC attorney Blake Anders arrested on fraud charges. Then another. Judge Harold Benson taken into custody in corruption probe. By lunchtime, Blake was on every news channel, not giving his usual smug interviews, but being escorted out of his law firm in handcuffs, looking significantly less polished than usual. His perfect hair was messed up, his expensive suit was wrinkled, and his face had this expression of absolute shock, like he genuinely couldn't believe consequences existed for people like him. Judge Benson was arrested at the courthouse that same afternoon, which had a beautiful poetic justice to it, being dragged out of the same building where he'd destroyed so many lives. My phone rang around 2. Clarissa. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. What did you do, Garrett? She screamed, her voice hitting frequencies that probably violated noise ordinance laws. How is this happening? Blake said everything was legal. The judge said, "Oh, nothing." I interrupted calmly, taking another bite of my terrible donut. Just checking on my $100 savings account. Funny how things work out. The silence on her end was absolutely delicious. Within a week, the divorce ruling was overturned. All of it. The house, the business, the money. Everything had to be returned because the entire proceeding had been fraudulent. Clarissa's accounts were frozen pending investigation. Blake, trying to reduce his sentence, flipped on her faster than a pancake at IHOP, admitting she'd helped fabricate evidence and plan the whole scheme. Turns out loyalty isn't really a thing when you're facing federal prison time. The best part? My kids finally came around. Sophie called first, crying and apologizing. Then Caleb. Then Liam, who said, "Dad, you're kinda badass." "Son," I told him, feeling lighter than I had in months. Revenge is just patience wearing a nice watch. Clarissa? Last I heard, she was working at a dentist's office again, driving a 12-year-old Nissan that sounded like a dying goose. Blake got 3 years in federal prison. Judge Benson lost his pension and got 5 years. And me? I was free, peaceful, and hilariously rich. Turns out karma doesn't forget. It just compounds interest. 6 months later, I sold Harlow Building Supplies to a bigger firm for $10 million. Combined with Grandpa Eugene's gift, I was sitting on wealth that would have made my former self jealous. But here's the thing. I was different now. Smarter, more careful, less interested in impressing people who didn't matter, and more focused on actually living a life that meant something beyond the size of my bank account. I bought a modest house, nothing fancy. No chandeliers. No perfectly manicured lawn that required a part-time groundskeeper. No marble foyer where my ex-wife could stand in a silk robe welcoming her lawyer boyfriend. Just a comfortable 3-bedroom place with good Wi-Fi, a functional kitchen, and neighbors who didn't know or care how much money I had. The kids loved it because it actually felt like a home instead of a museum designed to impress country club friends nobody actually liked. But the real project, the thing I was genuinely proud of, was the Eugene Foundation. I started it with $5 million and a simple mission: teaching financial literacy to working-class families who were one paycheck away from disaster. The kind of people my grandfather had been. The kind of people who deserved to understand that time and patience could change everything. Toby helped run it, handling the logistics while I taught classes every month to groups of factory workers, warehouse employees, restaurant staff. People who worked hard and got paid too little and had never been taught that compound interest existed or that investing wasn't just for rich people. I'd stand in front of these classes in community centers and union halls, and I'd tell them my story. Not the sanitized version, but the real one. How I'd lost everything. How I'd lived above a laundromat eating ramen. How my grandfather's patience had saved me. Time makes money grow, I'd say. And hiding your wealth makes people show their true colors. Don't flash what you have. Build quietly. Be patient. Clarissa was working at a dentist's office now, back where she'd started 20 years ago, except older and significantly less optimistic. Her 12-year-old Nissan sounded like it was auditioning for a horror movie sound effects reel. Blake was serving 3 years in federal prison, probably regretting every decision that had led him to believe he was untouchable. Judge Benson lost his pension and got 5 years, which seemed appropriate for someone who'd spent years selling justice to the highest bidder. And me? I was free, peaceful, and hilariously rich in ways that mattered beyond money. My kids were back in my life. Toby and I were closer than ever, and every night before bed, I'd reread Grandpa Eugene's letter and think about how he'd taught me the most valuable lesson from 65 years in the past. Never let them see all your cards. The best revenge is compound interest and patience with a punchline.